The town of Dustwater clung to the edge of the Nevada territory like a stubborn burr on a saddle blanket. It wasn't a town you aimed for. It was a place you ended up when your horse went lame or your canteen ran dry. For Luke Danner, it was both. The sun had beaten down on him for 3 days straight, a relentless hammer on the anvil of the salt flats, and the dust had worked its way into every crease of his skin, his clothes, and his soul. He was a man worn smooth by the road, his face a roadmap of hard miles and his eyes holding the flat, distant look of someone who had seen too much and expected to see more of the same. All he wanted was a bottle of whiskey that didn't taste of alkali, a bed that didn't have bed bugs, and 12 hours of dreamless sleep. Then he would be on his way, pushing west toward whatever came next. The Red Lantern Saloon was the only establishment in Dustwater that looked like it might offer the first of those things. Its namesake lantern, hanging from a rusty chain, was a faded, fly-specked pink, its glass clouded with grime. Luke pushed through the bat-wing doors, the sudden cool and dimness of the interior a welcome relief. The place smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and a faint, cloying perfume. A few prospectors hunched over their drinks at a scarred wooden bar, their faces as empty as their pockets. A man in a dirty apron was wiping down the counter with a grayer rag, his movements slow and without purpose. Luke settled onto a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the others. He dropped a heavy coin on the wood. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was a low rasp, unused for most of the day. The bartender barely glanced at him. "The good stuff or the rot gut?" "Something in between." The bartender grunted and was about to reach for a bottle when a soft voice intervened. "I'll take care of this customer. Jeb." Luke looked up. A young woman had emerged from a doorway behind the bar. She was slender, with hair the color of dark honey pulled back from a pale face. Her dress was a simple blue calico, clean but frayed at the cuffs. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place in the grimy saloon. She wasn't smiling. In fact, her expression was one of intense, controlled neutrality, as if she were holding her breath. "What can I get for you, mister?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. They were a startling shade of gray, clear and direct. "Whiskey," Luke repeated. "A bottle. Something that's seen the inside of a barrel for more than a week." She nodded, a small, bird-like motion. She turned and retrieved a dusty, dark green bottle from a high shelf. It was corked and sealed with wax. It looked old, promising. She placed it on the bar in front of him with a deliberate gentleness. "That'll be $22, she said, her voice perfectly even. Luke froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. He stared at her, then at the bottle, then back at her. $22. In a town like this. That was more than the cost of a good horse. It was a preposterous, insane amount of money. It was the kind of price you named when you wanted a man to either start a fight or leave. For a moment, the old instincts flared in him, the anger, the suspicion. He felt the weight of the Colt Peacemaker on his hip, a familiar and grim comfort. His eyes narrowed, scanning her face for the telltale signs of a swindle. A smirk, a flicker of greed, a challenge. He found none. Her gaze was steady, her face a pale mask. But as he held her stare, he saw something else, something deep in the cool gray of her eyes. It wasn't malice. It was an appeal, a silent, desperate plea. It was as if the price itself was a question, and his answer would determine something far more important than the contents of his wallet. The weariness washed over him again, dousing the spark of anger. He was too tired for this. Too tired for a fight. Too tired for a mystery. He just wanted the drink. He slowly pulled out his leather poke, untied the drawstring, and counted out the coins onto the bar. Gold eagles and silver dollars made a heavy, clinking pile on the wood. He pushed them toward her without a word. The woman's shoulders seemed to relax by a fraction of an inch. a release of tension so subtle he might have imagined it. She swept the coins into a small wooden box, her movements quick and precise. Then she looked at him again. "My name is Lila," she said. "My sister and I would like a word with you, in private." Before Luke could process the request, another figure appeared beside her, stepping from the same shadowed doorway. It was like looking at a reflection in a still pond. The second woman was identical to the first, the same honey-colored hair, the same slender build, the same pale, serious face. But where Lila's expression was one of tight control, this woman's was one of raw, undisguised anxiety. Her gray eyes were wider, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "This is May," Lila said, her voice low. "Please, it won't take long." Luke's mind raced. A private room, 2 beautiful young women, a ridiculous sum of money paid without argument. It had all the makings of a classic Badger game, a setup to rob a weary traveler. He should have stood up, taken his bottle, and walked out. Every instinct he had honed over years of watching his own back screamed at him to do just that. But he didn't. He looked from Lila's guarded face to May's terrified one, and the mystery deepened. May looked less like a predator and more like prey. There was a story here, a dangerous one, and he had just paid $22 for the opening chapter, against his better judgment. A sliver of curiosity pierced through his fatigue. "Lead the way," he said, his voice flat. Lila gave a curt nod. She came around the bar, and May followed a step behind, her eyes darting nervously toward the other patrons, who paid them no mind. Luke picked up his expensive bottle of whiskey and followed them through the doorway into a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air here was stale, thick with the smell of cheap soap and something else, something like fear. They led him to a small room at the end of the hall. It might have been an office once. A small, cluttered desk was pushed against one wall, and a pair of straight-backed chairs faced it. A single oil lamp on the desk cast long, dancing shadows. It was a cramped, airless space. The door clicked shut behind them, and Luke felt the muscles in his back tense. Lila turned to face him, her hands clasped behind her back. May stood near the door, as if ready to bolt. The silence in the small room was heavy, broken only by the faint, muffled sounds of the saloon outside. "Thank you for coming," Lila began, her voice a little unsteady now that they were alone. We have a proposition for you, Mr. Danner," Luke supplied. "Luke Danner." "Mr. Danner." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "We have a rather urgent and unusual request. We want you to marry us." Luke stared at her. He waited for the punchline. He looked from Lila's impossibly serious face to May's wide, frightened eyes. He thought of the $22. Was this the joke he had paid for a strange, elaborate piece of frontier humor meant to unnerve the greenhorns? He almost laughed. The whole situation was absurd. "Marry you," he said, a note of disbelief coloring his tone. "You mean both of you?" "Yes," Lila said, her chin lifting a little. "It would be a legal arrangement, a contract. One of you, or both. The law is flexible on some points out here. The point is, we need a husband. We need one tonight." Luke ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. He looked at the bottle of whiskey in his other hand. This was getting stranger by the minute. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know me from Adam. I just walked in here, and I'm not the marrying kind." He took a step back toward the door. "If this is some kind of joke, it's a good one, but I think I'll just take my bottle and find a room for the night." "It's not a joke." The words burst from May, her voice trembling. It was the first time she had spoken. Her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "Please," Lila said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. She took a step closer, and for the first time her composure cracked completely. The mask fell away. and Luke saw what lay beneath. "You have to listen. This isn't a game. This is our last chance." Luke stopped. He looked from one twin to the other, and the last bit of amusement drained out of him, replaced by a cold, prickling unease. He had been a hired gun, a guard on wagon trains, a man who lived by reading the subtle signs of danger in other people. He had seen fear in all its forms, the wild panic of a man about to die, the cold sweat of a gambler who'd lost everything, the simmering terror of a homesteader facing a raid. But this was different. What he saw in their eyes now wasn't a trick. It wasn't an act. It was a profound, soul-deep dread, the kind of fear that settles in the bones and doesn't leave. It was the terror of two people trapped in a cage with the door about to be thrown open, and a wolf waiting on the other side. This wasn't about love, or romance, or even a swindle. They weren't looking at him with the hopeful eyes of a bride-to-be. They were looking at him the way a drowning person looks at a piece of driftwood. They were looking at him as if he were their only way out. Luke Danner had come to Dustwater for a drink. He had paid $22 for a bottle of old whiskey. But as he stood in that small, shadowed room, looking into the desperate, terrified eyes of the saloon owner's twin daughters, he had a sinking feeling he had just bought himself a whole world of trouble. The air in the small room was thick enough to breathe. Luke stood rooted to the floorboards, the heavy bottle of whiskey feeling absurdly trivial in his hand. His mind, trained by years of violence and survival, worked methodically, sorting through the possibilities. A trick, a trap, a delusion brought on by grief or desperation. But no matter how he dissected it, he always came back to the raw, unvarnished fear in their eyes. It was the one piece of the puzzle that felt real, the one thing that couldn't be faked. His gaze shifted from their faces, becoming distant. The smell of stale soap in the room faded, replaced by another, sharper scent in his memory, the high, thin air of the Rockies, tainted with the coppery smell of fresh trouble and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Just a week ago, he had been earning his pay. The job had been simple on paper guide, a merchant's train carrying mining equipment through Comanche territory. He wasn't a guide, he was a guard, a gun. His job was to be the man who stood between the cargo and the kind of trouble that carried rifles. Trouble had found them at dusk, in a narrow pass where the rocks bled red in the setting sun. It wasn't a big raid, just a handful of desperate men, their faces grim with hunger and resentment. The merchant, a portly man named Abernathy with soft hands and a loud voice, had wanted to fight. Luke had advised against it. He knew the odds. He knew the cold arithmetic of a firefight. But Abernathy, full of whiskey and pride, had given the order to fire. The memory wasn't a clean narrative. It was a chaotic collage of images and sounds, the shocking boom of rifles echoing off the canyon walls, the scream of a mule, high and terrified, the sight of a young driver, no older than 17, slumping over his reins with a look of stunned surprise on his face. Luke had done his job. He had moved with a deadly economy that had been drilled into him since he first picked up a gun. He had fired, reloaded, and fired again. His face a grim mask, his mind a cold, calculating machine. When the echoes faded and the smoke cleared, he was standing. So was Abernathy. 3 of their drivers were not. The attackers were gone, leaving behind dark stains on the rocks. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a hollow, ringing void filled with Abernathy's quiet sobbing and the low groans of a wounded man. They had buried their dead in shallow, rocky graves, and the rest of the journey had been a grim, silent procession. When they reached the mining camp, Abernathy had paid him his due, his hand trembling, his eyes refusing to meet Luke's. The man had looked at him not with gratitude, but with a kind of horrified awe, as if Luke were not a man but the very violence he had summoned. And maybe he was right. Luke had looked at his own hands then, calloused and steady, and felt a profound, soul-crushing weariness. He hadn't wanted that fight. He had simply finished it. He had taken the blood money and ridden away, aiming for nowhere in particular. Just away. Away from the killing. away from the choices, away from being the man people turned to when things fell apart. He didn't want to be anyone's solution anymore. He just wanted to be left alone. He brought his focus back to the two women in front of him. They were the very definition of other people's trouble. This was exactly what he was running from. "No," he said, the word coming out as a low growl. "Whatever mess you're in, you'll have to find another man to pull you out. I'm just passing through." He turned, his boots scraping on the wooden floor. His hand was on the doorknob when Lila's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the air. "We chose you because you didn't flinch." Luke paused, his back still to them. "Flinch at what the price of your whiskey?" "At the price," she confirmed. "But more than that, we've watched men come into that saloon for weeks. They swagger and they boast. They drink and they brag about the fights they've been in, but there's a fear in them. A fear of being cheated, a fear of being challenged, a fear of looking weak. You just looked tired. You saw a ridiculous price. You knew it was wrong. And you paid it anyway because you decided a fight wasn't worth the energy. You weren't afraid. You were just done. That's a different kind of man." He slowly turned back to face her. Her intelligence was a palpable thing. She hadn't just seen his actions. She had read the intent behind them. And it unnerved him. She stood straight, her chin high, a stark contrast to her sister, who seemed to shrink with every passing second. May's wide, pleading eyes were fixed on him, her silence a constant, desperate scream. She was the terror. Lila was the resolve. Together, they were a trap he was walking deeper into with every breath. "You're a smart woman," Luke said, his voice flat. "Too smart to be hitching your wagon to a stranger. There must be men in this town, a sheriff, deputies." Lila gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "The law in Dustwater is a man named Sheriff Brody. He takes his orders and his pay from the same man we're running from. Every other man in this town who isn't already on that payroll is too scared to even look at us sideways. They know what's coming. They just pray it doesn't come for them next." Luke felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut. This was bigger than a personal dispute. It had the smell of something organized, something rotten that went all the way to the core of the town. It was the kind of fight that couldn't be won with a single, clean draw. It was a war of attrition, a slow bleeding that would drain a man of everything he had. He wanted no part of it. "My answer is still no," he said, his voice hard. "I'm sorry for your trouble, but it isn't mine. I did not come here to be anyone's champion." He tried to put the memory of the young driver's face out of his mind, the surprised look as his life emptied out of him. He tried to forget the weight of Abernathy's gold, feeling less like payment and more like a brand. He was not a hero. He was a tool, and he was done being used. He saw the hope drain from Lila's face, replaced by a stark, brittle despair. May let out a small, choked sob, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. They looked utterly, hopelessly lost. Lila took one last, desperate step toward him. Her voice was barely a whisper now, all its previous strength gone, leaving only the raw plea beneath. "We don't need a champion," she said, her gray eyes locking with his. "We don't need a husband in truth. We don't need love or affection. We just need a name on a piece of paper, a shield, a legal maneuver to protect us until we can get away." She paused, taking another shaky breath. Her next words hung in the air, heavy and cold with certainty. "If you don't help us," she said, her voice cracking, "if you walk out that door, then by sunrise tomorrow, we will be dragged out of this town. His men will come for us. We will become his property. And that will be worse than anything you can imagine." The words struck him with a physical force. Dragged out. Property. Worse. It wasn't an exaggeration. He'd seen the frontier swallow people whole. He'd seen what power without principle did to the vulnerable. He knew exactly what worse meant. He looked at Lila, the smart, sharp woman who was out of clever plans. He looked at May, The quiet sister whose terror was so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He thought of the $22 sitting in their cash box. It wasn't a payment for whiskey. It was a payment for a choice. He had bought a ticket to this moment, and now he had to decide which train to take. The one leaving Dustwater, heading toward the quiet, empty horizon he craved, or the one heading straight into the heart of the very trouble he had sworn to leave behind. His hand fell away from the doorknob. The whiskey bottle felt impossibly heavy. He let out a long, slow breath, the dust of 1,000 miles mingling with the scent of their fear. He didn't say yes, but he didn't walk away. He just stood there, caught between the ghosts of his past and the terrifying certainty of their future. Luke let out a breath that did little to ease the knot of tension in his chest. He gestured with the whiskey bottle toward one of the straight-backed chairs. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. "And tell me everything. Start with who you're so afraid of." Lila guided a trembling May into one of the chairs before taking the other. She sat on the edge of the seat, her back ramrod straight, a woman gathering the last of her strength for a final, desperate charge. Luke remained standing, a sentinel by the door, his posture a silent statement that he was still minutes away from leaving. "His name is Bishop Crane," Lila began, her voice low and steady, as if she were reciting a catechism she had practiced 100 times in her head. "He isn't from Dustwater. His holdings are mostly in the next county, centered around the silver boom in Virginia City and Carson. But his influence, it's like a shadow that stretches. He owns land, mines, freight companies. He owns politicians and lawmen. They say he controls everything that moves in or out of 3 towns, and Dustwater is the next one on his list." Luke remained silent, his face unreadable. He had heard the name. Bishop Crane wasn't a gunman or an outlaw. He was something more dangerous. He was a builder of empires, a man who used ledgers and contracts like weapons. He didn't get his hands dirty with common street violence. He bought the street, the buildings, and the men on it, and then squeezed until he owned their souls, too. "Our father, Samuel," Lila continued, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "He owned this saloon. It was his life. He built it from the ground up. But times have been hard. The new railroad spur bypassed Dustwater, and the life started to drain out of this place. Father, he was a proud man. He wanted to give us a future. He saw this place failing, and he wanted to build it back up, maybe add a small hotel." She looked up, and her eyes held a flicker of her father's foolish, hopeful pride. He needed capital. The banks in Carson wouldn't give him a loan. He was too small, Dustwater too remote, but Bishop Crane was willing. He made it seem like a kindness, an investment in the community. He invited Father to his office, served him expensive brandy, and spoke of partnership and progress. Luke could already see the shape of the trap. It was an old story, one he'd seen play out a dozen times in a dozen different towns. The friendly loan, the helping hand that slowly closes into a fist. "Father signed the papers a month ago," Lila said. She stood, went to the cluttered desk, and opened a drawer. She pulled out a folded sheaf of documents and brought it to Luke. Her hand was steady, but he saw a slight tremor in her fingertips as she held it out to him. He took the contract. The paper was heavy, official. The script was a precise, elegant hand, but the words themselves were a tangle of legal thorns. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew his way around a bill of sale and a water rights agreement. He scanned the dense paragraphs, his eyes picking out the key phrases, the loan amount, the exorbitant interest rate, the payment schedule. And then he found it, tucked away in a long, convoluted clause near the end. Lila pointed to the spot with a trembling finger. "There," she whispered. "Clause 7, the collateral addendum." Luke read the words, his lips moving silently. The language was deliberately obscure. Speaking of the settlement of all physical and dependent assets held under the debtor's wardship in the event of default, it was weaselly, slippery language. but its meaning was chillingly clear. "He means you," Luke said, his voice flat. "He put you and your sister into the contract as collateral." "As liquidated assets," Lila corrected him, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "That's the term his lawyer used. It means if the debt is not paid in full by the date specified, everything our father owned becomes the legal property of Bishop Crane, the saloon, the deed to this building, and us." The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a crime of passion or greed. It was a transaction. A man's daughters, listed on a ledger sheet like furniture or livestock. "Why would your father sign something like this?" Luke asked, though he already knew the answer. "He didn't read the fine print." May spoke up, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "Crane's man hurried him along, told him it was standard language. Father was so proud to have secured the loan, so hopeful. He trusted him." "And the due date?" Luke asked, his eyes still fixed on the damning clause. Lila's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her pale cheek. The first payment was due in 2 days. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into a dark and ugly picture. A ruthless man, a diabolical contract, an impossible deadline. But there was still a missing element. "Your father," Luke said, looking up from the paper. "Even if he defaulted, he could have fought this, taken it to a judge, claimed coercion." "No," Lila whispered, shaking her head. The tear was followed by another. "He can't, because Bishop Crane made sure he couldn't." She straightened up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her grief momentarily burned away by a cold, hard anger. "Yesterday morning, Father was fine. He had breakfast. He was worried about the payment, but he was alive. An hour later, he was on the floor, clutching his stomach. The doctor called it a sudden affliction of the gut. He was dead before noon." "Poison," Luke stated. It wasn't a question. Lila nodded. A sharp, jerky movement. It was subtle. Something slipped into his morning coffee, something that works fast and leaves no trace. There's no proof, of course, just a dead man, a contract, and a deadline. Sheriff Brody filed the report, ruled it death by natural causes, and offered his condolences. We saw him having a drink with one of Crane's men an hour later. The room was silent save for May's stifled weeping. The whole monstrous plan was laid bare. Crane hadn't just set a trap. He had sprung it. He had removed the only person who could contest the contract, turning a legal battle into a simple foreclosure. With Samuel dead, the estate and everything in it would pass to his creditor. "Crane's men are already here," Lila added, her voice regaining its urgent edge. "They arrived on the afternoon stage. They're staying at the boarding house, waiting. Not making a move, just waiting for the deadline to pass. Once it does, they will come with this contract, and the sheriff will back them. They will take possession of this building, and they will take possession of us legally, with the full authority of the law in this town." Luke finally understood the depth of their desperation. They were trapped not by chains, but by a piece of paper, backed by a bought sheriff and a killer's ambition. They had no one to turn to, no court to appeal to. They were entirely, utterly alone. "The marriage," he said, the absurd proposal suddenly making a terrifying kind of sense. "It's a countermove," Lila explained, her voice quickening as she saw the understanding in his eyes. "A legal one. It's our only chance. Under the territory's laws, a married woman is not chattel to be passed on as part of her father's estate. Her legal standing is tied to her husband. If we are married, we are no longer our father's dependent assets. A marriage contract, filed and witnessed, would supersede a debt contract. It would muddy the waters, create a legal challenge that Crane couldn't just brush aside. It might not save the saloon, but it would save us. It would give us the time we need to get out of this town, to run." It was a flimsy, desperate gambit, a shield made of paper held up against a storm. But she was right. It was a move. It was the only move they had left on the board. "And it has to be tonight," Luke concluded, "because the deadline is in 2 days, and Crane's men are waiting to collect the moment it expires." "Yes," Lila breathed, the word a mix of relief and terror. "The circuit judge won't be through for another month, but the town clerk, he can officiate and file the papers. We just need a man, a groom, any man." Luke looked down at the contract in his hand, then at the 2 terrified women before him. He thought of the $22 he'd paid for a bottle of whiskey. A test, Lila had said. A test to see if he was the kind of man who would back down from a fight. He hadn't known it then, but when he had counted out those coins, he had been answering their question. Now, they were asking another one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what he was going to do now that he knew the truth. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with the weight of their father's death and their own impending doom. Luke folded the contract, the sharp creases he made in the paper seeming loud in the charged silence of the small room. He didn't hand it back to Lila. Instead, he tucked it into the inner pocket of his worn duster. It was a small, almost unconscious gesture of possession, as if by holding the document he was holding the problem itself. He looked at the 2 sisters, their faces pale and etched with a fragile hope that was almost painful to witness. He gave them a single, curt nod. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low command. "Don't open this door for anyone but me." Without waiting for a reply, he slipped out of the room, closing the door gently behind him until he heard the soft click of the latch. He moved down the narrow, dim corridor, not with the heavy tread of a weary traveler, but with a renewed, predatory stillness. The fatigue was still there, a deep ache in his bones, but beneath it, something else had awakened the old, familiar alertness of a man who knows he is in a hostile place. His senses were sharp, attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest shift in the air. He paused at the edge of the doorway leading back into the main saloon. From the shadows of the corridor, he surveyed the room. It was the same as when he'd left it, the same handful of prospectors nursing their drinks, the same listless bartender, Jeb, wiping the same spot on the counter. Everything looked normal, but it felt entirely different. Before, it had been a picture of simple, dreary quiet. Now, Luke could see the hidden threads of tension running beneath the surface. He wasn't just in a saloon anymore. He was on a stage, and he was just beginning to see the other actors. There were 2 of them. They hadn't been there when he first arrived. They sat at a small, round table in the corner, a half-empty bottle of cheap rye between them. They weren't miners or ranchers. Their clothes were too new, their hands too clean, except for the calluses on their palms that spoke of handling guns, not shovels. They weren't talking. They weren't drinking much. They were just sitting, their chairs angled slightly so that they had a clear view of the entire room, including the corridor Luke had just exited. They were watching. Their stillness was a coiled threat, a patient, unnerving presence that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. They were Crane's men. Luke's eyes flicked over them, cataloging details. The bulge under the coat of the larger man, the way the smaller one kept his right hand resting casually on the table, just inches from the butt of his pistol. They were professionals, not common thugs. This wasn't a simple collection job. It was an occupation. His gaze drifted past them, toward the saloon's grimy front windows, across the dusty main street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows from the facade of the assayer's office, and there, standing in the deep shade of the wooden awning, was a third man. He was dressed in a simple black coat and hat, his form lean and still. He wasn't pretending to be waiting for anyone. He wasn't window shopping. He was simply standing there, his body angled toward the Red Lantern Saloon, his head slightly tilted, a statue carved from shadow and menace. Even from this distance, Luke could feel the intensity of his gaze. He was the overseer, the wolf watching the fold. A cold certainty settled in Luke's gut. Lila hadn't been exaggerating. The town was already under siege. Its residents just didn't know it yet. The trap wasn't just for the sisters. It was for all of Dustwater. Crane wasn't just taking a saloon. He was establishing a foothold. He stepped back from the doorway, melting into the shadows of the corridor. He had seen enough. The threat was real. It was organized. And it was patiently waiting for the clock to run out. He leaned against the wall for a moment, the rough wood pressing into his back. He closed his eyes, thinking of the open road, the simple peace of a lonely campfire under a canopy of stars. That was what he wanted. Not this, never this. He was just a man passing through, a ghost who wanted nothing more than to drift on to the next horizon. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself off the wall and walked back to the office. The bottle of whiskey, long forgotten, still in his hand. He opened the door and stepped inside, the quiet click of the latch sealing the three of them back into their small, desperate world. Lila and May looked at him, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. 3 of them, Luke said, his voice flat. 2 in the main room, 1 across the street. They're not here to cause a scene. They're here to wait. May flinched, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. Lila's jaw tightened. Luke set the whiskey bottle down on the desk with a heavy thud. He turned his gaze on Lila, his eyes narrowed and piercing. All the weariness, all the detached cynicism he had felt before, was now focused into a single, sharp point. "Why me?" he asked, the question coming out low and hard. "You said it yourself. You've been watching men come and go. This town may be half dead, but it's not empty. There are other men here, miners, ranch hands, men with a stake in this place. Why choose a stranger who is just looking for a drink?" It was the one question that still gnawed at him. Their desperation made sense. The legal gambit made a crazy kind of sense, but their choice of him did not. He was a variable they couldn't possibly have accounted for. Lila met his gaze without flinching. Her intelligence was her shield, and she used it now, her words precise and deliberate as she laid out her reasoning. "We watched them all," she said. "The miners drink and talk big, but they're scared of losing their claims. The ranch hands work for men who tell them to keep their heads down and not make waves. Sheriff Brody is a lost cause. Everyone here has something to lose, something that keeps them quiet and afraid." She took a small step closer, her voice dropping. "Then you walked in. You didn't swagger. You didn't boast. You just took a seat at the bar. When I told you the price of that bottle, a price designed to be an insult, every man in this saloon would have either cursed me out or started a fight to prove his pride. You did neither. You just looked at me, and you paid. It wasn't weakness. It was stillness. We saw a man who wasn't afraid of being cheated, wasn't afraid of a fight, and wasn't afraid of walking into a strange town alone. You were the only one who walked in here without fear." A dry, mirthless smile touched Luke's lips. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, bone-deep irony. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a weariness that went far beyond tired muscles. "You read the signs all wrong. What you saw wasn't a man without fear." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "That was just a man who was too tired to care. There's a difference." He was turning away, turning back toward the door, back toward the idea of leaving, when the third voice in the room, quiet and trembling, stopped him cold. "We don't need you to care," May whispered. Luke looked at her. She had shrunk in her chair for most of the conversation, a terrified bird in a cage. But now she looked directly at him, her gray eyes, so like her sister's, but filled with a different, softer light, were swimming with a desperate sincerity. Her voice was barely audible, but her words filled the small, silent room with an astonishing weight. "We don't need you to love us," she said, her voice cracking on the word. "We don't need you to be a hero. We just need you to stand there, by our side, just for a little while. That's all." The simple, heartbreaking plea cut through Luke's cynicism like a hot knife through tallow. It stripped the situation of all its complexities. The marriage, the contract, the danger, and laid it bare. It was no longer a request for a husband or a gunslinger. It was a request for a witness, a body, a man to simply stand in the way. She wasn't asking for the hero he wasn't. She was asking for the man he was, a weary obstacle, a shield of last resort. He looked from May's pleading face to Lila's resolute one. He thought of the patient men in the saloon and the watcher in the shadows across the street. He thought of the lonely road he had been chasing for so long. For the first time, he wondered if he wasn't running toward peace, but just running away from himself. May's words echoed in his mind. Just stand there. It was the simplest and the most impossible request he had ever heard. The weight of May's plea settled in the small room, heavier than any spoken threat. It was a simple, stark request that bypassed all of Luke's defenses. To stand there, it was something even a tired man could do. He looked from her face to Lila's, and in their shared, desperate hope, he saw the end of his road west, at least for tonight. "All right," he said, the word scraping its way out of his throat. The relief that washed over their faces was so profound it was almost a physical force. "I'm not agreeing to any marriage. I'm not signing any papers. But I'll stay. I'll see you through to the morning." It wasn't the promise they wanted, but it was more than they'd had a minute before. It was a reprieve, a stay of execution. "But we do this my way," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming sharp and authoritative. The weary traveler was gone, replaced by the man who had guarded wagon trains through hostile territory. "First thing, we close up. Not just for the night. We close up for good. Jeb the bartender. You pay him what you owe him and send him home. The last of the customers. 2, I want this place empty." Lila nodded, her mind already racing. "And the men outside? They'll see us closing early. It'll make them curious, maybe nervous. Good. Let them wonder. Once the place is clear, no one goes out and no one comes in. The doors are barred, the windows are shuttered. We'll be locked in here until sunrise." The hours that followed were a blur of quiet, purposeful activity. Lila handled Jeb, pressing a few extra coins into his hand and telling him to take the next day off. He grumbled, but complied, his eyes full of a dull curiosity he knew better than to voice. The last of the prospectors were ushered out into the deepening twilight. As the final one stumbled through the bat-wing doors, Luke was already there, sliding a heavy iron bar into the brackets on the main entrance. The sound of it slotting into place was a deep, definitive thud that echoed in the sudden silence of the saloon. Working with Lila, he moved through the room, securing the shutters over the grimy windows, plunging the saloon into a tomb-like darkness lit only by a single lantern they left burning on the bar. The world outside vanished, replaced by a claustrophobic, self-contained universe of dark wood and the smell of stale whiskey. The space felt smaller, the shadows deeper, every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind whistling under the eaves was amplified in the quiet. "You two, upstairs," he commanded, his voice low. "Take the lamp from my room. Stay there. Don't come down, no matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" May asked, her voice a tremor in the dark. "I'm going to sit," he said, "and I'm going to listen." He took up a position in a chair in the far corner, the same table where Crane's men had been sitting. From here, he could see both the barred front door and the narrow corridor that led to the back. He placed the half-full bottle of whiskey he'd bought on the table, but he didn't drink. He just sat, his duster still on, his Colt Peacemaker resting heavy on his hip. He let his eyes adjust to the gloom until he could make out the shapes of the tables and chairs, the long line of the bar, the glint of the lantern on a stray glass. And then he waited. The night outside came alive with the sounds of a frontier town settling down, the distant barking of a dog, the lonely cry of a train whistle miles away. the faint, tinny music from another establishment down the street. Then, slowly, those sounds faded, replaced by a deep and profound silence. The town slept. The saloon was a silent island in a sea of darkness. Luke didn't sleep. He listened to the building's nocturnal conversation, the groan of aging timbers, the scuttling of a mouse in the walls. He was a man accustomed to the long, empty hours of the watch. He sat perfectly still, a part of the shadows, his breathing slow and even, but his mind was working. He was cataloging the sounds, sorting the normal from the abnormal, waiting for the one note that was out of place. It came hours later, when the moon was high and the darkness outside was at its deepest. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, scraping sound from above, the sound of a boot heel dragging on the cedar shingles of the roof. Luke was on his feet before the sound had fully registered, moving with a silence that was absolute. He didn't draw his gun. Not yet. He melted into the deeper shadows of the corridor, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Another sound, a soft thud, as if someone had dropped from the roof's peak to the lower awning over the back of the building. The sisters would not have heard it. A sleeping person would have dismissed it as the wind. But to Luke, it was as loud as a gunshot. They weren't waiting for morning. He glided down the corridor, his boots making no sound on the worn floorboards. He passed the office where they had talked and continued toward the back door, the one that led to the alley. The scraping had stopped. Now there was only silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of held breath. He flattened himself against the wall beside the back door. He listened, faintly, on the other side of the thick wood. He heard a delicate metallic scratching. The lock. Someone was picking the lock. Luke slowly drew the peacemaker from its holster. The oiled click of the hammer being pulled back was unnervingly loud to his own ears. He held his breath, the cold, checkered grip of the gun a familiar anchor in his hand. The scratching stopped. There was a soft, triumphant click as the tumblers in the lock gave way. The door began to open. A slow, agonizing creep. A sliver of pale moonlight cut through the darkness of the corridor, widening inch by inch. A figure emerged, a lean silhouette against the night sky. The man moved with a practiced stealth, easing the door shut behind him without letting it make a sound. He took one step into the corridor, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the interior darkness. It was the last step he took. Luke moved like a striking snake. He didn't fire. A shot would bring the whole town, including the rest of Crane's men. Instead, he lunged forward, his left arm wrapping around the intruder's neck, cutting off any cry. His right hand, holding the heavy barrel of the Colt, slammed down hard on the man's temple. There was a dull, sickening thud and a sharp grunt of pain. The man's body went limp, his weight slumping against Luke. Luke lowered him to the floor, his movements efficient and brutal. He tore a strip of cloth from the man's own shirt and gagged him tightly before he could regain his senses. He found a coil of rope in the pantry and bound the man's hands and feet with a series of unforgiving knots. The whole violent exchange had taken less than 10 seconds and had been conducted in near total silence. He dragged the unconscious man into the office and dumped him onto the floor. He lit the lamp on the desk, the sudden flare of light making him squint. The man was young, wiry, dressed in dark clothes, a second-story man, a scout. As the man's head lolled to the side, Luke saw it. On the side of his wrist, just visible below his cuff, was a small, dark tattoo. It was a crude depiction of a coiled whip inside a circle. A cold dread, far deeper than what he'd felt before, settled over Luke. He knew the mark. Crane's Wranglers. They weren't just hired guns. They were a brand of mercenary known throughout the territories. They specialized in hostile acquisitions. When a stubborn rancher refused to sell, or a mining claim was disputed, men like Bishop Crane would hire the Wranglers. They didn't just intimidate. They dismantled. They would poison wells, scatter herds, start fires. They were methodical, patient, and utterly without mercy. They were the architects of ruin. And Luke Danner knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that this was not about a saloon. This was not about two girls. Bishop Crane wasn't trying to collect a debt. He was conquering a territory. The contract, the death of the father, the Watchers. It was all part of a larger, systematic campaign to break Dustwater, to seize control of its resources and its people, starting with its most visible and vulnerable assets. The intruder wasn't here to hurt the girls. He was here to probe the defenses, to search for documents, to prepare the ground for the main invasion. The weariness fell away from Luke, burned off by a surge of cold, clear anger. He had tried to run from this life, tried to find a quiet corner of the world where trouble wouldn't find him. But he saw now that men like Crane were the reason there were no quiet corners left. They spread like a sickness, turning everything they touched to poison. He left the bound man on the floor and walked out of the office, his steps now heavy and deliberate. He went to the front of the saloon, to the massive iron bar securing the doors, and slammed another wooden beam into place for good measure. He walked back to his saddlebags, which he'd left near the bar, and pulled out his spare pistol, a Colt Dragoon, checking its load before tucking it into his belt. He heard a floorboard creak on the stairs. Lila was standing there, a lamp held high, her face a mask of terror. May was peeking out from behind her. They had heard something after all. Luke looked up at them, and the man they saw was not the tired stranger from that afternoon. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a glint of hard, unyielding steel. His face was a grim landscape, set in lines of cold resolve. He gave them a slow, deliberate look, his gaze moving from one to the other, making a silent promise that was far more binding than any marriage certificate. "If I'm in this," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the silent saloon, "I'm not in it halfway." The first light of dawn was a dirty gray, filtering through the cracks in the shutters and painting pale stripes across the dark, silent saloon. The night had passed in a state of suspended animation, a long, tense breath held in the lungs of the old building. With the coming of the light, that breath was released in a collective, weary sigh. Luke had spent the hours before dawn interrogating their captive. The man, whose name was Silas, was sullen and tight-lipped, but years of dealing with hard men had taught Luke that pain wasn't always the best key to unlock a man's tongue. Fear was better. He didn't lay a hand on Silas. He simply described, in quiet, methodical detail, what it was like to be left in the desert with no water, a day's walk from the nearest well, by the time the sun was up. Silas had confirmed what Luke already knew: he was a wrangler, and his job had been simple reconnaissance. He was to get inside, find the location of Samuel's strongbox, and report back. The main force was waiting for the deadline to pass, but Crane was an impatient man. He wanted to know if there were any other documents, any other complications, before he made his final move. Luke left Silas bound and gagged in the cool, damp cellar, a place of cobwebs and forgotten barrels. When he returned to the main room, he found Lila and May huddled at one of the tables, a pot of coffee brewing on the saloon's small stove, its bitter aroma cutting through the stale air. They looked like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn in the morning light. The adrenaline of the night had worn off, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion. A new dynamic had settled over them. They were no longer three strangers thrown together by circumstance. The shared danger, the violent intrusion, and Luke's decisive action had forged them into something else. A unit, a garrison of 3, besieged in a wooden fort. "He's in the cellar," Luke said, pouring himself a cup of the black coffee. It was scalding hot, and he drank it without flinching. "He won't be a problem, but his friends will be. They'll know he's missing soon." "Then we have to move fast," Lila insisted, her voice regaining some of its sharp edge. She had her father's contract spread on the table like a battle map. "The town clerk, Mr. Abercrombie. Opens his office at 9. If we go now, we can have the marriage license filed before anyone even knows what's happened." Luke shook his head, taking another slow sip of coffee. "No." "No?" Lila stared at him, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "What do you mean? No, this was the entire plan. It's our only legal protection." "It's not protection. It's a target," Luke countered, his voice low and firm. "You think a man like Crane, a man who uses poison and hires wranglers, is going to be stopped by a piece of paper filed by a town clerk he probably already owns. The minute we step outside, his men will see us. The minute we file that paper, Crane will know. All it will do is tell him exactly what our strategy is. It's a defensive move, and we're in no position to defend." While they spoke, May watched them both, her eyes wide. She looked at the heavy Colt peacemaker on Luke's hip, then at her own trembling hands. She had felt so utterly useless during the night, a frightened child hiding at the top of the stairs. Luke noticed her gaze. He set his coffee cup down and turned to her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "May," he said, his voice gentle, "come here." He led her away from the table, to a clear space by the bar. He unholstered his peacemaker and laid it on the polished wood. The gun looked heavy, deadly, an obscene object in the quiet morning light. May flinched. "You're afraid of it," he stated, not unkindly. "That's good. You should be, but you need to understand it. You might need to use it." I can't," she stammered. "I've never even held a gun." "I'm going to teach you," he said simply. He broke open the loading gate, ejected the cartridges one by one, their brass casings clinking on the wood. He showed her the empty cylinder. "It's a machine, nothing more. It does what you tell it to do." For the next hour, while Lila paced impatiently by the desk, Luke worked with May. His movements were slow and deliberate. He didn't just show her how to shoot. He started with the basics. He had her hold the empty gun, feel its weight and balance. Then he handed her loose cartridges from his gun belt. "Loading," he said, his voice a low murmur. "This is more important than firing. In a fight, you'll run out of shots faster than you think. A loaded gun is life. An empty one is a piece of iron. Watch my hands." His large, calloused fingers moved with a surprising dexterity, seating a bullet, rotating the cylinder with a practiced flick of his thumb, seating the next. He did it again and again, a slow, methodical rhythm. Then he had her do it. Her fingers were clumsy at first, the cartridges slipping from her nervous grasp. But Luke was patient. He would steady her hands with his own, his touch surprisingly gentle as he guided her thumb to the right spot, showed her how to feel the cylinder click into place. "Don't think," he murmured. "Just feel. The bullet goes in. You turn. It becomes a rhythm. In, turn, faster." Slowly, her fumbling gave way to a hesitant competence. She was still afraid, but a new focus was dawning in her eyes. The gun was no longer just a terrifying symbol. It was a mechanism she was beginning to understand. It was an act of profound trust, a transfer of knowledge that was more intimate than any conversation. Meanwhile, Lila, driven by Luke's dismissal of her plan, had turned her nervous energy to another task. "If we're not hiding, we need to know what we're fighting for," she muttered to herself. She knelt before her father's old iron strongbox, a heavy, dust-covered relic tucked away in a corner of the office. She spun the combination dial, her brow furrowed in concentration. The numbers were a faint memory from her childhood, a game her father had taught her. After several frustrating attempts, she heard a deep, satisfying clunk. With a grunt of effort, she pulled the heavy iron door open. The inside smelled of old paper and dried ink. It was filled mostly with dusty ledgers, receipts, and the saloon's original deed. She began to sift through them, her initial hope fading, but then, at the very bottom, tucked inside a worn leather portfolio, she found them. It wasn't just one deed. It was a half-dozen, deeds to small, seemingly worthless parcels of land scattered around the outskirts of Dustwater, and with them, something even more valuable, notarized claims to water rights along the Dust Creek, the only reliable year-round water source for miles. Her breath caught in her throat. Her father had never spoken of these. He must have been buying them up quietly over the years. A slow and secret investment in the town's future. This wasn't just about a saloon. This was about the land, the water. This was about the very lifeblood of Dustwater. This was what Crane was truly after. She gathered the documents and hurried back into the saloon, her face flushed with a triumphant, vindicated energy. "Luke, I found it. This is it." She spread the deeds across the table just as May successfully loaded the pistol for the 5th time without dropping a single cartridge. "This is what he wants," Lila declared. "It's not the saloon. It's the water rights. It's the land. Don't you see, this makes the marriage plan even more crucial. As my father's heirs, we inherit this. If I'm married, my husband becomes the legal protector of my inheritance. It shields everything." Luke looked from the deeds back to Lila, his face grim. "I see what he wants," he said, "but you're still thinking like a victim. You want to build a paper wall and hide behind it. That's not a shield. Lila, that's a cage." "What are you talking about?" she shot back, her frustration boiling over. "It's the law." "It's a law Crane will break or buy his way around," Luke retorted, his voice rising with an intensity that made May jump. "We don't win by hiding these. We win by showing them. We take these deeds and that contract your father signed, and we show them to every man in this town. We show them that Crane isn't just coming for a saloon. He's coming for their water. He's coming for their future. You want to fight him in a clerk's office. I want to fight him in the street, with the whole town watching." "You want to start a war?" she cried, aghast. "We can't win a war against him. My way is safer. It protects us." "Your way gets you out of town with your lives. Maybe my way might just save the town itself." "Why won't you do it?" she demanded, her voice cracking with desperation. She balled her hands into fists. "It's one signature on one piece of paper. It's the smartest, safest move we have. Why are you so dead set against it?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and accusatory. Luke's jaw clenched. The cold, hard glint was back in his eyes. "Because my name is all I have left," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I don't have land. I don't have a home. All I have is my word and my name, and I will not tie my name to a woman I do not know." His words struck Lila with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a rejection of her plan. It was a rejection of her, of them. It was a declaration of his own code, a line he would not cross, even for them. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a deep, aching hurt. All their plans, all their hopes, had crashed against the unmovable wall of this stranger's pride. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken things. Luke stood his ground, a man of iron principles. Lila stared at him, her mind reeling. He was right about the fight. She knew it in her gut, but his refusal felt personal, a judgment on her and her sister. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. The sharp, argumentative edge was gone, replaced by something softer, something far more powerful. She looked him directly in the eye, a woman making one last, honest appeal not to a gunslinger, but to a man. "Then stay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay one more day, and know who we are." Lila's invitation, "Know who we are," hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact. And in the tense, sun-drenched day that followed, Luke Danner began to do just that. He saw the quiet, unyielding strength in Lila as she meticulously went over their father's ledgers, her mind as sharp as any lawyer's. He saw a fierce, protective courage bloom in May as she practiced loading the peacemaker until her fingers were raw, her initial terror replaced by a grim determination. They were not just victims. They were survivors, the daughters of a proud man, and they would not be erased without a fight. They spent the day planning, their voices low and urgent in the stuffy back office. Luke's strategy was simple, born of 100 desperate situations you never fight on the enemy's terms. A direct confrontation was suicide. Hiding was a slow death. They needed a third way. The idea came from one of the ledgers. Lila pointed to a recurring entry, a weekly delivery of 2 cases of whiskey to the town hall, a standing order for the councilman's private meetings. The next delivery was due in the morning. "We can't get the documents to a judge," Luke reasoned, tapping the leather portfolio that held the damning deeds and the fraudulent contract. "But we can get them to the town council. We can get them into the public record. We create a scandal that Crane can't just bury." The plan they hatched was as desperate as it was dangerous. They would open the saloon that night. They would act as if nothing was wrong. And when Crane's men came, and they knew they would come, Luke would create a diversion, a big one. In the chaos, Lila and May would get the portfolio into the whiskey crate destined for the town hall. Then they would run. As dusk settled, a new kind of silence fell over Dustwater. The usual evening bustle was gone. Doors were shut, windows were shuttered. The air was thick with a fear that had a name: Bishop Crane. He had arrived an hour earlier, not with a parade, but with a quiet, chilling finality. He didn't ride a magnificent stallion. He sat in a polished black buggy, a specter of wealth and power, and behind him rode 6 men, their faces hard and empty, the coiled whip of the wranglers visible on their saddlebags. They didn't look like cowboys. They looked like soldiers in an occupying army. Crane did not deign to set foot in the Red Lantern. He took the finest suite at the Dustwater Hotel across the street. But his men came, all 6 of them. They pushed through the bat-wing doors, their spurs ringing on the floorboards, and the few locals who had dared to venture out for a drink immediately drained their glasses and vanished into the night. The leader was a tall, raw-boned man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a look of permanent disdain. His name was Harlan. He slapped a gold coin on the bar that was worth more than the saloon's entire inventory. "The bar is closed to the public tonight," he announced, his voice a gravelly proclamation. "Mr. Crane has reserved it for a private celebration. The girls will serve us." He looked directly at Lila and May, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And your man here," he added, nodding at Luke, who was quietly wiping glasses behind the bar. "He can make himself useful and keep the bottles coming." It was a calculated act of humiliation. They were being forced to play host to their own executioners. The hours that followed were a slow, grinding torment. The wranglers drank with a grim purpose, their laughter loud and ugly in the empty room. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet officially won. They treated Lila and May with a cold, contemptuous disdain, ordering them about as if they were already part of Crane's property. Luke moved in the background, a shadow of quiet obedience. He refilled glasses, replaced bottles, his face a mask of placid indifference. But beneath the mask, he was a coiled spring, every nerve ending alive. He watched Harlan. He watched the brutish, heavy-set man named Cole, who seemed to delight in May's fear. He tracked the position of every man, every gun, every exit. He was a predator, feigning subservience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment came just after midnight. The men were drunk, their movements sloppy, their senses dulled. Cole, the large, brutish one, cornered May as she was collecting empty glasses. He blocked her path, a leering grin on his face. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" he slurred, his foul breath washing over her. "Too pretty to be pouring drinks in a dusty hellhole like this. Mister, Crane has better uses for a girl like you." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. May froze, her face a mask of pure terror. Lila started forward, a cry on her lips, but Luke was already moving. He had been setting a fresh glass on the bar, in one fluid, seamless motion. He turned. There was no anger on his face, only a cold, deadly calm. He took 2 steps and brought the heavy whiskey tumbler down across the side of Cole's head. The sound was a sickening crunch of glass and bone. Cole roared in pain and surprise, staggering back, his hand flying to his face, which was suddenly streaming with blood. For a single, heartbeat-long second, the saloon was plunged into a stunned silence. Every wrangler froze, their drunken haze evaporating. Then, all hell broke loose. "Get him!" Harlan bellowed, his hand streaking for his gun. But Luke was no longer there. He had already kicked a heavy oak table on its side, creating a makeshift barricade. The saloon erupted into a volcano of violence. A wrangler lunged over the bar, and Luke met him with a brutal right cross that sent the man crashing into a pyramid of bottles. Another 2 came at him from the side. Luke grabbed a chair and swung it like a club, splintering it against the chest of one man and sending the other sprawling. It wasn't a fight, it was a storm. Luke was the whirlwind at its center, a blur of motion and savage efficiency. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to create chaos, to be the sole focus of every ounce of rage in the room. He needed to keep all 6 of them busy. As the first punch was thrown, Lila grabbed May's hand. "Now!" she hissed. They scrambled for the back room. The sounds from the saloon were terrifying shouts, curses, the splintering of wood, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Lila fumbled for the leather portfolio while May dragged the heavy whiskey crate from its spot by the back door. Her hands, once so clumsy, moved with a desperate speed as she pried at the crate's lid with a small crowbar. Back in the main room, Harlan finally cleared his holster. The first gunshot was a deafening roar that ripped through the chaos. Wood splintered from the table Luke was using for cover. The brawl had just become a gunfight. Luke drew his own peacemaker, the familiar weight a grim comfort in his hand. He didn't fire wildly. He fired with purpose. A shot into the shelves behind the bar sent a shower of glass and liquor raining down. Another shot took out the saloon's main lantern. The room was plunged into a flickering, shadowy hell, lit only by a few smaller lamps. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his duster. He felt the hot sting as it grazed his arm. He returned fire, driving 2 of the wranglers to seek cover. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and his makeshift barricade wouldn't last forever, but he just needed a little more time. In the back, May finally wrenched the lid off the crate. Lila shoved the portfolio deep inside, wedging it between 2 bottles of whiskey. They slammed the lid back on and, with trembling hands, hammered the nails back into place. Suddenly, a stray bullet from the saloon ripped through the thin wall of the office, shattering a framed picture just inches from Lila's head. They screamed. Luke heard them. His time was up. He kicked over a table with one of the remaining oil lamps on it. The lamp shattered, and a river of fire instantly spread across the whiskey-soaked floorboards. Flames licked up the walls, casting demonic, dancing shadows. "Fire!" one of the wranglers screamed, his voice thick with panic. The fire was the perfect accomplice. It created a wall of smoke and heat, sowing confusion and terror among his attackers. Through the swirling black smoke, Luke made a fighting retreat toward the corridor. He fired 2 more shots to keep their heads down, then turned and ran. He burst into the back room just as Lila and May were dragging the crate back to its original position. The air was thick with smoke. The roar of the fire was growing louder. "Go out the back now," he yelled, grabbing them both and shoving them toward the alley door. They tumbled out into the cool, dark air of the alley, their lungs burning, their ears ringing. They stumbled a few yards away and turned to look back. The Red Lantern Saloon was becoming an inferno. Orange flames were punching through the roof, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Shouts and curses could be heard from inside as the wranglers, trapped between a gunman and a firestorm, tried to escape the blaze. Their plan had worked. The documents were safe. On their way to the town hall, they had survived. As they stood there, catching their breath in the shadows, Lila's gaze was drawn across the street to the hotel. In the large second-floor window of the finest suite, a lamp was lit. A figure stood there, a silhouette against the warm, yellow light. He was holding a glass, perfectly still, watching the saloon burn, watching his own men scramble for their lives. It was Bishop Crane. He wasn't in the fight. He had been watching the entire time, a king observing the bloody work of his pawns from the safety of his castle. The sight was colder and more terrifying than any of the violence they had just escaped. The fire in the saloon was hot, but the ice in Crane's soul could freeze the world. The morning air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and despair. The Red Lantern Saloon was a blackened skeleton, a gaping wound in the heart of Dustwater's Main Street. A crowd of townspeople had gathered in the dusty space before the town hall, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a shame they couldn't quite hide. They had stood by and watched the town's decay, and now they were here to witness what felt like its final rites. Luke, Lila, and May stood at the front of the crowd, a small, isolated island of defiance. They were grimy, exhausted, and running on little more than frayed nerves and bitter coffee. Across from them stood Harlan and the remaining wranglers. They were bruised and singed from the fire, but their arrogance was undiminished. They stood with the smug confidence of men who knew the deck was stacked in their favor. The town clerk, a portly, sweating man named Abercrombie, nervously cleared his throat. He had been convinced by Harlan to hold this public meeting to officially settle the matter of the late Samuel's estate. He held up the whiskey crate, its wood slightly charred, which had been delivered as scheduled. "As per the standing arrangement," Abercrombie announced, his voice trembling slightly, "this delivery was made to my office, at the request of Miss Lila here. We will open it before the town to verify its contents before addressing the matter of the Red Lantern's outstanding debt to Mr. Bishop Crane." Harlan smirked. He thought it was a pathetic, theatrical attempt to garner sympathy. With all eyes on her, Lila stepped forward. Her voice, though strained, was clear and steady. "People of Dustwater," she began, "you all knew my father. You know he loved this town. What you don't know is that he was a victim of a man who wants to own, not just a saloon, but all of you. Bishop Crane forced my father to sign a fraudulent contract. We have proof that this was never about a simple loan. It was about stealing the future of this town." With a dramatic flourish, she pried open the crate's lid and pulled out the leather portfolio. A collective gasp went through the crowd as she held up the deeds and the water rights claims for all to see. He wants your land. He wants your water. For a moment, a flicker of anger, of defiance, lit the faces of the assembled townsfolk. They saw their own names, their own neighbors' properties. On the maps accompanying the claims, they saw the truth in her words. But Harlan just laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. He stepped forward and took the portfolio from her, handing it to Abercrombie. "A touching performance," Harlan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And these are indeed interesting documents. However, they are irrelevant. What is relevant is this." He produced the original contract between Samuel and Crane. A legal, binding note of debt. Samuel failed to make his payment. His estate, as outlined in the collateral addendum, is forfeit. It is a simple, legal matter. "It was signed under duress," Lila insisted, her voice rising. "He was threatened." Harlan's smile widened. "An interesting accusation, but an accusation is not proof. Territorial law is very clear on this point. For a claim of coercion to invalidate a contract of this magnitude, the signing must have been observed by a corroborating witness, a witness who would have affixed their own signature to the document, or at the very least, be willing to testify now." He turned to Abercrombie. "Mr. Clerk, examine the contract. Do you see a witness signature?" Abercrombie's face fell. He scanned the document. his finger tracing the lines of ink. "No," he mumbled. "There is only the signature of Samuel and Bishop Crane." He looked up, his eyes full of a pained apology. "Without a witness, the contract stands." The words fell like a judge's gavel. The flicker of hope in the crowd died, replaced by a resigned, defeated silence. It was over. Their desperate, fiery gamble had failed. All they had done was destroy their own home for nothing. May let out a heart-wrenching sob, the sound of a soul breaking. She buried her face in her sister's side, her body racked with grief. Lila stood frozen, her face ashen, the deeds and papers fluttering from her numb fingers to the dusty ground. She had been so sure, so certain that the truth would be enough. But the law, in the hands of a man like Crane, was not a shield for the innocent. It was a club for the powerful. Luke felt a familiar, bitter poison fill his veins. Rage. It was a cold, clean rage directed at Crane, at the town, at the world, but most of all, at himself. He had let himself get dragged in. He had let himself believe, for a fleeting moment, that one man could make a difference. He was a fool. He had broken his one rule, don't get involved, and this was the price. The sister's ruin. His own failure. He turned without a word. He pushed his way through the silent, parting crowd, his face a mask of stone. He didn't look back at the weeping sisters. He couldn't. The sight of their defeat was a mirror of his own. "Luke!" Lila called after him, her voice thick with tears. But he didn't stop. He walked with a stiff, angry stride to the livery stable, his mind made up. He was done with Dustwater, done with other people's hopeless fights. He would get his horse and ride until he forgot the names Lila and May, until he forgot the smell of the burning saloon and the taste of this bitter defeat. This is what happened when you stood for something. You ended up standing in the ashes. He saddled his horse, his movements rough and efficient. He checked the cinches, his knuckles white. He was throwing the saddlebags over the horse's back when a voice, cracked and weak with disuse, cut through the quiet of the stable. "You're just going to leave them?" Luke turned. An old man stood in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. He was frail, his clothes little more than clean rags, his face a web of wrinkles. It was old man Elias, the town mute, a harmless eccentric who did odd jobs for food and was thought to be simple-minded. He had been a fixture in Dustwater for years, a silent, shuffling ghost. "It's over, old man," Luke growled. "There's nothing left to do." "So you run," the old man said, his voice a dry rasp, as if his throat were full of dust. Luke froze. The man had spoken. In all the years anyone could remember, Elias had never uttered a single word. He took a step out of the shadows, his eyes surprisingly clear and sharp, fixed on Luke. "I saw you," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I saw you fight for them. I saw you stand when every other man in this town sat down." Luke stared at him, bewildered. From across the street, Lila had seen the old man approach Luke and had started running toward the stable, her heart pounding with a confused, desperate hope. The old man ignored her approach. He kept his eyes locked on Luke. "I was waiting," he said, "waiting for a man who wouldn't break, a man who wouldn't run when things got hard." "Elias," Lila breathed, stopping in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at the man she had known her whole life, the man who had been a second father to her, a gentle, silent guardian. Elias turned his head and gave her a sad, gentle smile. "I'm sorry, child. I had to stay quiet, to keep you safe." He turned back to Luke, and his frail body seemed to gain a new strength, a new resolve. "Now it's time to speak." He walked past them, out into the main street, toward the stunned crowd that was beginning to disperse. He raised a trembling hand. "Wait!" he called out, his voice carrying with surprising force. Harlan, who was about to leave, turned with a look of annoyance. "What is it now, old man?" Elias walked right up to him, his frail body dwarfed by the wrangler's size, but his eyes held no fear. "You spoke of a witness," he said, his voice ringing in the sudden silence. "The contract requires a witness." He took a deep, shuddering breath and pointed a bony finger at Harlan. "I am the witness," he declared. "My name is Elias. I was Samuel's friend and a father to his girls. I was in the back room of the saloon the day your boss came to visit. They thought I was just a deaf-mute, a piece of furniture. They didn't see me, but I saw everything. I saw Bishop Crane hold a pistol to Samuel's head. I saw him force my friend to sign away his life. I saw it all." A tidal wave of shock rolled through the crowd. Lila gasped, her mind reeling with the impossible truth. Elias, her silent, gentle Elias, had been there. He had seen it. "He disappeared after that," she whispered to Luke, who had come to stand beside her. "We thought Crane's men had gotten to him, or that he'd run away in fear." Elias had heard her. He looked back at her, his eyes full of a terrible sorrow. "I did run, child," he said. "I ran into the hills. I hid. I was a coward. I was afraid Crane would silence me for good, and silence you along with me. So I pretended to be dead to the world. I waited. I prayed that someone would come with enough courage to stand up, so that my small voice might have a chance to be heard." His gaze found Luke's. "And then you came." Harlan stared at Elias. His smug confidence shattered, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His clean, legal victory had just exploded in his face. It was no longer a matter of a simple debt. It was now a public testimony to coercion, extortion, and a motive for murder. The game had just changed. Elias's words struck the town square with the force of a lightning bolt, electrifying the dead air. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd, Harlan, even Lila and Luke, were caught in a state of suspended disbelief. The town mute, the harmless old ghost, was the key to everything. Harlan was the first to recover, a snarl twisting his scarred face. "Lies," the old man's addled. "He's a crazy." He never finished the sentence. From across the street, the double doors of the Dustwater Hotel burst open. Slamming against the outer walls, Bishop Crane strode out onto the porch, his face a thundercloud of pure, unrestrained fury. He was dressed in a fine black suit, but his civilized veneer had been burned away, leaving only the raw, predatory ambition beneath. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, were fixed on the scene, and in them was the promise of murder. He descended the steps, his polished boots kicking up puffs of dust, and walked directly into the center of the square. His remaining wranglers, jolted into action, moved to flank him. He ignored them. He ignored the crowd. His entire being was focused on the frail old man who had just dismantled his empire. "You!" Crane hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You should have stayed dead." He turned his murderous gaze on Harlan. "Clean this up, all of it. The old man, the girls. I want them gone. I want this whole town to forget this day ever happened." Harlan drew his pistol, a look of grim relief on his face. This was an order he understood. This was territory he knew well. He leveled the gun at Elias. And then something impossible happened. A sound, a heavy, rhythmic clang, clang, clang. Mr. Henderson, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, had stepped out of his smithy. He held a massive ball-peen hammer in one hand, and he was rhythmically striking it against a discarded iron wagon wheel rim. It was not a sound of violence. It was a sound of work, of purpose. It was the sound of the town's heart, suddenly starting to beat again. He stopped in front of his shop, the hammer held loosely at his side, and simply stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle between the wranglers and the town hall. He didn't say a word. He just watched them. Harlan hesitated, his gun still aimed at Elias. Then another sound, the scraping of a heavy bolt. Mr. Gable, the dry goods store owner, A mousy man who was afraid of his own shadow had barred the door to his shop from the inside. It was a small act, a gesture of non-cooperation, but it was defiance all the same. A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Gable, pulled her 2 young children behind her skirts, but she didn't run. She stood her ground, her face pale but resolute. One by one, a change rippled through the crowd. Men who had been looking at the ground lifted their heads. People who had been shrinking away took a half-step forward. They didn't have guns. They had shovels, hay forks, the simple, heavy tools of their lives. They formed a quiet, living wall, a human barricade of ordinary, terrified people who had finally found the one thing they were no longer willing to lose. They stood between Crane and the 2 women he wanted to claim. Crane's face contorted in a mask of pure, aristocratic rage. He could not comprehend it. These were insects, ants. He had come to crush them under his heel, and they were daring to get in his way. His fury, unable to lash out at the entire town, finally found its true target. He turned and locked eyes with the one man who was the source of it all. Luke Danner had not moved. He stood beside Lila and May, a quiet center in the storm he had unleashed. He watched the town find its courage, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest. It felt something like hope. "You!" Crane spat, pointing a trembling finger at him. "The drifter! The hired gun! I know your kind. You have no stake here. You have no name, no land, no honor. Why? Why would you do this?" His voice rose to a near scream, the question tearing out of him, a cry of genuine, furious bewilderment. For $22, all of this chaos, for the price of a bottle of whiskey. Luke looked at Crane, and for the first time since he'd ridden into this dusty hell, a real smile touched his lips. It was a small, sad, weary smile. He took a half-step forward, placing himself squarely in front of Lila and May. "No," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the dead silent square. "Not for the money." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd, over Elias's newfound strength, over May's terrified resolve and Lila's fierce, unwavering stare. "I did it for 2 women who put their faith in a stranger when they had nothing left to believe in," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I did it for an old man who found his voice when the whole world was silent." He turned his gaze back to Crane, and the smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard clarity. This was his confession, his penance, and his declaration of war, all in one. "And I did it because I've spent too much of my life being a coward running from fights that needed fighting. I was tired of being the man who rides away." He took a deep breath, and it felt like the first clean breath he'd taken in years. "I'm done running." For a long second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Crane's face broke, the last shred of his control snapping. He made a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. It was all the signal Harlan needed. The world exploded. Harlan's gun roared, but Luke was already moving. He didn't draw on Crane. He drew on the men he knew were the real threats. His peacemakers seemed to leap into his hand. He fired twice, the shots so close together they sounded like one. 2 of the Wranglers on Crane's right crumpled to the ground before they had even fully cleared their holsters. Luke dove to the side, rolling behind a watering trough as bullets tore through the air where he had been standing. The townspeople screamed and scattered, ducking for cover. The square had become a killing field. From his new position, Luke fired again, his shot taking a 3rd Wrangler in the leg, sending him howling to the ground. Harlan and the remaining 2 men fanned out, using the corners of the buildings for cover, pinning him down. Luke knew he was in a bad spot. He was a single target against 3 guns. He risked a glance over the edge of the trough. Harlan was reloading, his scarred face a mask of concentration. It was his only chance. He burst up from cover, his pistol bucking in his hand, aiming for Harlan, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw the glint of sun on another barrel, the 4th Wrangler. He had to choose. He shifted his aim and fired. A split-second decision. The fourth wrangler grunted and fell back, his shot going wide. But that split second had cost him. It felt like a sledgehammer had slammed into his side. A white-hot, blinding pain erupted in his ribs, stealing his breath and sending the world tilting on its axis. He stumbled back, a grunt of agony torn from his lips. Harlan's shot had found its mark. He hit the ground hard, his head slamming against the packed earth. His vision swam. Through a haze of pain, he saw Harlan advancing, a triumphant, cruel smile on his face, leveling his pistol for the killing shot. Luke tried to raise his gun, but his arm felt like it was full of lead. It was over. He had made his stand, and this was the end of it. Then, a miracle. From the doorway of the town hall, a single, deafening shot rang out. It was not the crisp bark of a Colt. It was the deeper, throatier boom of a shotgun. Harlan's chest erupted in a cloud of dust and blood. He stared down at the hole in his stomach in disbelief, his pistol slipping from his nerveless fingers, before he collapsed in a heap. Luke, his vision clearing slightly, looked toward the source of the shot. Mr. Abercrombie, the sweaty, terrified town clerk, stood in the doorway, an old, double-barreled shotgun in his trembling hands. Smoke coiling from its barrels, the town's most timid man had just saved his life. Now only Bishop Crane was left standing. He looked at his fallen men, at the blood in the dust, at the shotgun in the clerk's hands, and, for the first time, pure. Animal fear entered his eyes. He turned to run. But he was surrounded. The townspeople, their fear burned away by the violence, had closed in. Henderson, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his hammer held ready. Gable appeared from his store, holding an old fowling piece. They were a ragged, unlikely army, and they had him trapped. At that moment, Sheriff Brody, who had been hiding in his office, finally made his appearance. Seeing the battle was decisively over, he marched forward with a look of stern authority. "Bishop Crane," he announced, drawing his pistol and pointing it at the unarmed man. "In the name of the law, I'm placing you under arrest." Crane stared at him, then laughed, a high, unhinged sound, but there was no escape. The blacksmith stepped forward and took his arms, his grip like iron bands. The fight was over. Lila and May rushed to Luke's side, their faces streaked with tears and dust. Lila tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the bleeding wound in his side. He was alive, battered and broken, but alive. It was truly over, with Elias's testimony, the signed contract, the deeds, and now a public gunfight with multiple witnesses. The case against Bishop Crane was sealed in iron and blood. There would be a trial, but the verdict was already written in the dust of the main street. He would not leave Dustwater alive. Bishop Crane, the empire builder, would hang. The world returned to Luke Danner in fragments. The first was pain, a deep, searing fire in his side that pulsed with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The second was a sound, the gentle, rhythmic drip of water into a basin. The third was a scent, clean linen and the faint, herbal smell of a poultice. He lay adrift in a sea of fevered dreams for days, floating between the gun smoke of his past and a quiet, hazy present. Figures moved at the edge of his vision, their voices soft murmurs that soothed the sharp edges of his delirium. When he finally opened his eyes and saw the world clearly, he was in a simple, clean room. Sunlight streamed through a new glass window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The walls smelled of fresh plaster and whitewash. He was lying in a real bed with clean sheets, and the pain in his side had subsided to a dull, manageable ache. He was alive. He turned his head slowly. May was sitting in a chair by his bedside, a book open in her lap. Though she wasn't reading, she was just watching him, her expression a mixture of relief and a quiet, profound sadness. When she saw his eyes were open, a small, radiant smile bloomed on her face. "You're awake," she whispered, as if a loud noise might frighten him away. Over the next few weeks, that small room became his entire world. The saloon's main floor had been gutted by the fire, a blackened cavern open to the sky. But the upstairs rooms, the family's living quarters, had been spared the worst of the flames. Smoke and water had ruined everything, but the bones of the place were strong. And with a strength Luke found astonishing, the town had rallied. Henderson the blacksmith had led the charge, organizing work crews to clear the debris and shore up the walls. Gable had donated lumber from his own dwindling stock. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Gable, took turns bringing food and helping Lila and May clean and repair the upstairs rooms. The sounds of hammers and saws, which should have been a mournful echo of destruction, instead became the sound of a town rebuilding itself, nail by nail, board by board. Luke watched it all from his window. He saw the slow, painstaking resurrection of the saloon. He saw Elias, no longer a mute ghost but a respected elder, directing the placement of a new support beam. He saw Abercrombie, his shotgun now safely put away, delivering official paperwork with a newfound sense of purpose. He saw the children of Dustwater playing in a street that was no longer ruled by fear. Lila and May were his constant caretakers. They were a study in contrasts. May was the quiet presence, changing his bandages with gentle, competent hands, reading to him from newspapers, her voice soft and steady. She had absorbed some of her sister's resolve. Lila was the driving force, a whirlwind of energy, directing the rebuilding, managing finances, her mind as sharp and focused as ever. But she had absorbed some of her sister's softness. She would often stop in the middle of a frantic day, come into his room, and just sit for a moment in the quiet, her shoulders slumping with a weariness she never showed to the outside world. They talked, but not about the gunfight, or Crane, or the contract. They talked about small things. Lila told him about her father's dream of adding a real kitchen, of serving hot meals instead of just pickled eggs. May told him about her mother's garden, which she was now tending in the small patch of land behind the saloon, coaxing new life from the soil. In these quiet conversations, Luke learned who they were. He learned of their hopes and their heartbreaks, their small joys and their deep, abiding love for their home. He spoke little of himself, but they didn't press. They simply made space for his silence, and in doing so, allowed him the room to heal not just his body, but the deeper wounds he had carried for so long. One afternoon, Lila came into his room with a mischievous glint in her eye. "The doctor says you can start walking," she announced, "which is good, because we have a job for you." With May on one side and Lila on the other, he took his first shaky steps. They half carried him downstairs, through the newly framed walls of the saloon, and set him in a sturdy, newly built chair right beside the front door. "There," Lila said, dusting off her hands with a satisfied smile. "You're hired. You're in charge of keeping the door." May laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to fill the half-finished room with light. "And we," she said, gesturing between herself and her sister, "will keep the bar." It became their new routine, every day. Luke would sit in his chair, a silent, watchful guardian, while the sisters directed the final touches on their new establishment. The townspeople would stop by, not as customers, but as friends, bringing a piece of hardware, a pot of paint, or just a word of encouragement. Luke became a part of the town's landscape, the quiet man in the chair by the door, a living symbol of the stand they had all taken. The day the new saloon officially opened, the entire town turned out. There was no garish red lantern hanging outside anymore. Just a simple, hand-painted sign that read, "The Prospect." Inside, the room was bright and clean, the new bar polished to a high sheen. There was music and laughter, and for the first time in a long time, the town of Dustwater felt like a place of new beginnings. That night, long after the last customer had gone home and the new lamps were turned down low, Luke sat alone at the bar, nursing a glass of water. The dull ache in his side was a constant reminder of the price of his new piece. He heard footsteps on the stairs, and Lila appeared, her hair down, her face soft in the lamplight. She was carrying a bottle and 2 clean glasses. It was a dark green bottle, dusty, sealed with wax. His bottle. She placed it on the bar in front of him. "I saved it for you," she said softly. She uncorked it with a quiet pop and poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold. She pushed 1 glass toward him. $22, she said, her voice a low, intimate murmur. Her eyes met his across the bar, and in them, he saw the entire story of the last few weeks, the fear, the fire, the hope. "For the whiskey." She paused, a small, hesitant smile playing on her lips. "And for the promise not yet spoken." It wasn't a proposal of marriage. He knew that now. It was something deeper. It was an offering, a home, a place at their table, a reason to stop. Luke looked down at the glass, at his own reflection shimmering on the surface of the whiskey. He saw the face of a man he barely recognized, a man whose eyes were no longer haunted by the empty road. He looked up at Lila, and then glanced toward the stairs, where he knew May was sleeping peacefully, safe in her own home. He had come to this town looking for nothing, a ghost passing through, and in the ashes, he had found everything. He picked up the glass, the cool, heavy crystal, a solid, reassuring weight in his hand. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and erasing the last of the shadows. "I don't need to run anymore," he said. May, drawn by their quiet voices, appeared at the foot of the stairs, wrapped in a quilt. She came and stood beside her sister. Lila poured a 3rd glass. The 3 of them stood there in the quiet of the saloon they had saved, the golden lamplight holding them in its warm embrace. They raised their glasses, the light reflecting in the whiskey, a constellation of tiny, hopeful stars. They didn't speak of the future. They didn't need to. A new chapter had begun, not with a forced contract or a shouted vow, but with a quiet understanding. They had found their reason not to leave. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate every one of you.